Welcome everyone to the Raising Toddlers Courageously conference. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm your host, Devon Kuntzman, toddler parenting coach, certified gentle sleep coach, and founder of Transforming Toddlerhood. I'm on a mission to dispel the myth that toddlerhood is terrible by helping parents embrace this sensitive developmental period and uncover the magic of toddlerhood while overcoming everyday challenges. I empower parents to transform their frustration, fear, and self-doubt into confidence in their parenting. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today and invest in yourself and your family. I am very happy to present Dr. Joseph Lee. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And I would love for you to start by telling our audience a bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, by profession, I'm a psychiatrist with a psychotherapy practice here in Los Angeles. I've been in practice now for about 14 or 15 years. Starting around the time when I think my wife was pregnant with our first, like a lot of new parents, we started reading books and trying to research things on, what was the best way to raise our kids. And I think that through a combination of that process and that particular moment in my own life, I started to integrate maybe a little bit more of what I was learning from the parenting side back into my practice, and then things from my practice back into parenting. And over the past few years, I've had the opportunity then to kind of take that knowledge, put together, and share it different places and do some speaking on parenting. So talking about parenting has kind of become my side gig outside of my primary role as a psychiatrist, kind of every day. And I really enjoy it because I think bringing a perspective that is both experiential, me being a parent myself, but also bringing in some valid and truthful ideas about really what is the optimal way, what's the best way, what's the healthiest way for us to raise our kids. And that's why I enjoy doing these things.
That's awesome. And I have heard you speak before, and you have so much wisdom to share about parenting, and I'm so excited to dive into that today. And I'm curious, why do you feel that toddlerhood is a sensitive and oftentimes misunderstood developmental period? Or do you feel that way?
I do. I know, we kind of have that language built around it where people talk about, the terrible twos, which obviously through that language is not necessarily a positive description of this particular time in life. So I do think that there's maybe some negative expectation that some people already have assigned to this particular period. And the reality is it's challenging. I think that putting things in perspective, when we're born into this world, we're pretty helpless. We need the adults and the caregivers in our life to really take care of almost all of our needs. We're very dependent on them. And I think that as kids go from infants to toddlers to young children, there's a period of time where, when they're really young, you can still carry them, you can wear them, they maybe sleep more reliably. So that's that first period. And I think parents have different goals during that time and make sure that their kids are safe and they're eating or they're nursing. I think toddlerhood is the very beginning of when you start to see these little people as people. You start seeing their personalities, language starts to kind of happen definitely in that phase. And so they start communicating to you directly, their thoughts or feelings, their emotions or needs. And so I think that toddlerhood oftentimes becomes maybe the very first time that parents have to be a lot more sort of active and reciprocal in their sort of interaction, their communication with these really, really young human beings. And I think that that's why it's challenging. But to kind of go back to your question, I do think that that challenging aspect of it also then kind of makes it easy sometimes for us to assign some level of negativity to that phase in life.
Yeah, I agree. And you're right that really toddlerhood is the first time where our parenting skills are really tested. I mean, prior to that, yes, our caregiving skills and nurturing skills, they're tested, but then the actual act of parenting and cultivating this relationship through words and kind of that dance of a child wanting to be independent at the same time, yet so reliant on us at the same time that that's really where the challenge comes in.
Right, right. And I think that, both, one of the things that starts to happen is that, kids, they can communicate, whether kids are learning early with like a nonverbal language or sign language, but also, words. That definitely happens around this time. And I think, like you said, that really compels a very different kind of dynamic between a parent and a child, where there is this back and forth versus, like you said, and I like the way you said it, that, that early phase is more caregiving, and toddlerhood really starts with maybe what we would say is parenting, and that's different.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I'm curious, how do you feel that perspective or the lens through which we see children and their behavior affects our parenting?
Yeah, so I think one of the topics I do like to talk about is, the difference between parenting from a behavioral perspective, meaning that you see what the kids are doing and you try to change what they're doing. So, if we're kind of describing what a behavioral approach is, versus something that's not a behavioral approach, which is maybe more relational or needs-based. I think that if we have a behavioral lens, then I think we approach trying to change what they're doing. And by changing what they're doing, we think it kind of like goes backwards into their psyche or their brain or their mind. And that behavioral change leads to, development, or oftentimes, the goal looking for with behavioral treatment is obedience. The alternative, which I think is more appropriate, is to look at behavior as a specific manifestation of a little human being trying to figure out the world. And they're trying to figure out what's going on and what's happening in their environment and why things are happening. And that includes with other people, but also with themselves. And so behavior is a manifestation of something going on internally. Now, the challenge is that this is definitely an age where kids don't necessarily have the thorough mastery of language, so they can't really articulate it so clearly. And they're also a little bit too young to have the level of self-awareness to kind of be able to look at themselves and articulate accurately why it is that they're doing, again, the behavior, what they're doing. So as a parent, that's the challenge. We have to kind of decode the behavior for the sake of figuring out what their needs are, what are they feeling, what are they thinking. And I think that's a healthier, better approach, because in that case, when you facilitate and you support and you help kids maybe name and describe what is going on inside of them, that actually does lead to them developing more self-awareness, awareness of what their feelings are, awareness of what their needs may be. And that approach, where we're looking at what's going on inside of them, actually does lead to, I think, what parents ultimately want, which is for their kids to internally sort of mature and become more able and competent in what they're doing. But I don't think a behavioral approach actually accomplishes that, even though I think that's still the intention of parents who have that approach.
Yes, because, I think for a lot of parents, it's counterintuitive because, what's been modeled for us in society, or perhaps the way that we were raised, that it's counterintuitive to think that to not focus on changing the behavior to create results that we want to see, because it oftentimes what's been modeled for us is that the behavior has to change for them to learn. But that's not
Right.
exactly where the teachable moments happen.
Right. And I think the other thing that's worth considering is that kids don't learn at this age through actually teachable moments. they're very experiential. So everything that they're learning is just sort of absorbed and integrated and tested and retested. And so even if we kind of think that there's these little lessons to be taught by modifying behavior, they don't actually learn that way at this age. And so even if that's our intention, I don't think we're accomplishing what we think we're accomplishing by trying to teach through behavior modification, because that's not really connected to developmentally how people learn. I think a good example to kind of think about how learning is so different at this age has to do with how we recognize people developing language, right? So a good example is, pretty early on, a kid would be able to start using words that identify themselves. They might name themselves by their own name. My son, is Benjamin, so he'd start saying things like Benjamin, and then they figure out something like me, right? And then somewhere along the word, they pick up a word like they want to leave or they want to go somewhere, and they say things like me go. So if we start with something like me go, right, at some point, that involves, so the kid will be able to say something like me goed if they're trying to describe to you something that they had gone to in the past. And then they hear the language from other people and people are responding to them, but they recognize that maybe sometimes instead of saying me, some people are saying the word I, and then they would say I goed. And then they recognize somewhere along the way that people don't use the word goed. They're the only ones that are using the word goed. And then they say I went. And eventually what starts off as like Benjamin, or however they kind of say that name. I think my son said like Benjamin for the longest time or something, when he was a toddler. That goes from just naming themselves with like basic language to eventually they want to tell you like, I went to the park, or later I went to the bathroom, and they can figure out the difference between why sometimes the word went is associated with going somewhere, and then went sometimes associated is like using the potty, right? So that's all an example of how kids learn at this stage in their life, and has nothing to do with lessons, right? No one sat down and taught a kid how to speak up until that certain point, right? Later on in school, like we work on the nuances of all that, but that's an example of age 2, age 3, this toddler years, how learning is done through like experience and feedback with the world, all the experiences.
This is such a great example because it really shows us how important the process is. That
Right.
during these, especially these early years, it's really hard just to sit down and teach something like an expectation or language, that it's really truly a process where little parts are internalized and built upon over time that then eventually get you somewhere near that end result that you were picturing. And so language is a really great analogy for this, because with language, we're very used to watching young children and seeing how their language develops. Like that's something that I think we can all really understand pretty clearly. And so what's interesting is whenever we look at behavior and we want to change behavior, we want to tell children and little children expectation or teach them what they should do. And sometimes we have this expectation, well, I already told you once, why can't you do this? Why haven't you internalized this? And it's really great just to remember back to this language example, because it truly illustrates how learning is a process through many building blocks, and things are absorbed through actual action, not through specific moments that we set up, but through just the daily life of what we're modeling and what kids are exposed to.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's also important about thinking about how kids learn experientially versus being taught through behavior modification is that when you learn through experience, it's very, very contextual. And they are picking up on that. They're picking up on the difference between, like I said, the use of language, how went is used as going a place, or went is also used as going to the potty, which is very different than a behavioral approach, which, kind of ultimately leads to probably like two outcomes, which is, if they did something that you wanted them to do, there's some sort of positive reward or praise or affirmation. And if they didn't do something that you want them to do, the other side would be some restriction or some consequences or some punishments. And the thing is, if all outcomes, when you're trying to do this behavioral approach and teaching, is really just leading to two places, a reward or a punishment, then it's not surprising that sometimes kids learn things only in such a way that they're trying to avoid punishment or they're trying to get a reward, but it's not really contextual. It's almost lost its context because the end point of even in the attempt to teach a kid something through a behavioral method is not really the experience. It's not really the context. For a kid, it's whether or not I got this thing I wanted, which felt good, or I got this other thing which made me feel bad. And even that kind of really doesn't really allow you to help kids understand their more sophisticated emotions. Emotions aren't just good, bad, and I always want to feel good and I never want to feel bad. And I think that sometimes can be a little confusing as well from a behavioral perspective, because even from like the most basic logic from a pretty young kid, that's not illogical for them to start making associations that when I feel good, that's good. I always want to feel good. And then when I feel bad because of a consequence, I never want to feel bad. And that becomes very confusing because when we talk about getting connected to feelings, that feelings, including the positive and the negative ones, they're all helpful. And these are all things that we want our kids to master as early as possible. But the behavioral approach starts to divide things, that starts to make it seem like good is good and bad is bad when it comes to feelings, which is not particularly accurate.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so powerful. And I completely agree with that because as humans, we're built to experience a full spectrum of emotion, and kids do that very well. They live in the present moment and they experience all of their emotions. And I think that, looking at this behavioral approach, that really one of these downfalls is that with time, they're losing that connection and that feeling to their emotions, and we I guess take away, like we start to filter it, and as we start to filter it, then some emotions become okay and some emotions aren't okay. And that's where we almost program kids to kind of come out of the present moment and to have these filters that don't necessarily serve us so well as adults. A lot of us as adults do have these filters where we think,
Mm-hmm.
this is
Yeah.
good, this is bad, and it hurts us personally, and it also hurts our parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I would say most people, like I said, my day job is a therapist. And I think a lot of people really struggle with understanding, like, what's the point of emotions like sadness or anxiety or loneliness. And they go into their whole adulthood sort of saying, I just want to feel good. And every time I feel bad, I'm feeling bad and I don't want to feel this way. Versus, a good example that parents from a pretty young age, including toddlerhood, one of the things we like to teach our kids and we feel like is important is we want them to be able to tell them for themselves the difference between feeling hungry, feeling tired, right? Or if they're hurting with physical pain. Now, physical pain is not pleasant. Feeling really hungry, that's not a good, joyful feeling. Being drowsy or tired, that's not a joyful feeling. But we don't assign, as parents, that level of negativity to those unpleasant feelings in the same way that we do, like when they cry because they're scared, or when they're angry. We might have this tendency to say, like, don't be mad, don't be sad, don't be anxious. But we don't say to our kids, like, don't be hungry. Instead, through this parenting interaction, we help our kids recognize, maybe by the patterns that we see in them, oh, they must be tired, right? They need a nap. Oh, they must be hungry. It's been a while since they've eaten. And so we kind of know these things as adults. We know these things as parents. And then we try to, like, teach our kids, no. When you feel that, you're hungry. And then we show them afterwards, like, see, you ate. Don't you feel better? Or you woke up from a nap. Remember, you were so grumpy before that. You took a nap, and then now you feel better. And so just like that, our feelings, including the unpleasant ones, if we're anxious, if we're angry, if as kids start sharing or not sharing, they get jealous. They have all these unpleasant feelings. But similar to those other tracks where we think of, like, maybe more physical discomforts that point to needs, that need resolution to make us then feel good. Same thing with feelings, so unpleasant feelings are signs that our kids' needs aren't met in the moment. And a developmental and needs-based approach is very similar, whereas parents, we recognize patterns in our kids and their routines, and we're like, oh, it's nap time, or it's time for them to eat. Similarly, we can say, oh, my kid is anxious because they're at an age where they're not quite ready, or they have separation anxiety. And we get that because they're still pretty young and they're really attached to their caregivers. And we understand that, but that anxiety is not something that we would judge them for, because, again, it makes sense. And then what we should do is then we respond, we give them a cuddle, and we tell them we'll be back at a certain time. We remind them that, maybe this transition into, like, daycare or something like that is happened a couple of times, and we come back and pick them up and they had fun, or whatever it may be. But we can let them know that these needs, which then lead to feelings, which, if we can help them meet those needs, then they actually feel good afterwards. But again, a behavioral approach kind of separates bad feelings as always being bad and good feelings as always being good. And I think that that's one of the distortions that we can even bring that into our adulthood, of having those same beliefs that good feelings are always good and bad feelings are always bad, which is, again, not really true.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And when we look beyond the behavior, we do see all these needs and abilities at the root of behavior. And I feel like that's one of the other pitfalls of the behavioral oriented perspective, is that we miss an opportunity to truly understand what's going on inside children, because when we're focused on the behavior, we're just so much focused on the outcome and changing the outcome that we don't have the opportunity to truly look inside and understand on a deeper level what our child is feeling or what they're trying to accomplish with this behavior. Because we know that toddlers are very resourceful at trying to get their needs met, and they'll try many different ways to get those needs.
Yeah, I think that that's probably something that's important to probably state pretty explicitly, which is any behavior you see is a child's best attempt under the circumstances at their developmental stage, based on how immature they actually are, right? To try to meet their own needs or to try to communicate their needs better. So that's what they're always doing. Now, the thing is, because they're pretty young, they're not going to be particularly sophisticated or do it like an adult, right? They're going to do it like a pretty young kid who's still learning about themselves, still learning about their bodies, still learning about their feelings, still learning about other people, learning about the world. and they're doing it, they're maturing and learning things all the time. It's a time of life where the rate of learning is remarkable compared to the rest of our life. So they're definitely picking up things at a really high rate, but at the same time, they are developmentally pretty early in life. So their skill set to, communicate or to get something done is going to basically almost always be in improvisation, right? Because they don't have a lot of experiences to draw upon that says this will always work. Or even if it works, they're at an experimental phase of their life and they're like, I know this works. Let me see if this also works. And they'll try something else, at a different time. So I think that's actually pretty important to state out loud when we're understanding what is behavior exactly. Behavior is your kid's attempt to communicate or to try to meet their own needs. And it's like a little kid's version of trying to get that done.
Yes, that's so great. And this is where conventional parenting starts to fail us as parents and caregivers and children, because it creates kind of a misalignment, I guess you could say, because when using rewards and punishments, we're not necessarily able to see sustainable, concrete change in a child's behaviors, because we're not really able to meet the needs. And so sometimes I call this Band-Aid parenting. It's like putting a Band-Aid on it in the moment, but then it creeps back up because it didn't actually heal. It's like treating the symptoms but not the root that's causing what's going on. And I just think that misalignment can be a really big challenge for parents, because they feel like, okay, well, this is working in the moment, but this keeps happening and happening and happening. So they never really get to the change that they want to see.
Right. And I think that the other thing that happens, just to kind of carry on with that, is even if you seemingly get to a place where your kid is following certain rules, or they seem to demonstrate an understanding of don't do this, because this particular stage in life, kids are growing a lot, both physically and mentally. Their own development sometimes will then make what you just quote unquote taught them irrelevant, because they've kind of developed past that. And then their development, they're going to try again to do it differently, in this new context, or with newfound abilities on their own part, as they get more words, or they're physically stronger, to be able to, I don't know, snatch a toy from another kid successfully with high levels of certainty, then new things need to happen. And then if you're a parent who's trying to always do this behavioral strategy, then you're always kind of behind in some sense, because you're always starting anew. And then you kind of have to like reset limits or change the reward, and sadly on the other side, you have to make the punishments still more effective, which, when we kind of break it down, what exactly is an effective punishment? It's something that makes a kid feel bad. And not necessarily specifically in the context of what they did that you think is wrong, but more often than not, it comes across as a generic, like, you disappointed mommy and daddy, or you disappointed us. And that's maybe why they feel bad, or they're fearful of the parents, because the parents bring the punishment, and that becomes like this very generic thing that they learn. So that also doesn't accomplish anything in terms of this ongoing developmental thing. And at the end of the day, I also think that this is partly why certain parents get exhausted, because there's a lot of effort in sort of always trying to get ahead of what's going on with your kids, and try to like anticipate, how they might do this or do that wrong, or the behavior is negative or something like that, versus, again, a developmental needs-based approach is always in the present. It's always at this moment in time. where are they in terms of what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. That's the developmental component. And then a needs oriented component says that, the feelings and then the behaviors are clues into, again, what they need in this moment. And what's interesting is if you are a parent who's able to, most of the time, help them with their needs, that actually is what facilitates the ease of development. It facilitates the ease of your kids learning and growing and incrementally gaining those small bits of self-sufficiency and autonomy. And look, every time your kid learns how to do something on their own, that's relief to parents. When kids can feed themselves, that's like a big deal. When kids can go to the bathroom by themselves, that's a big deal, because that's something that you as a parent no longer have to like monitor and be present and facilitate. So helping them through these developmental milestones with success and with support, and them believing and trusting that parents are a resource for having their needs met, is this more ideal, healthy, and I think less exhausting path for parents, which again, versus the behavioral approach, there's so much energy that parents have to expend doing and strategizing and anticipating and adapting. And even then, that process doesn't necessarily facilitate the specific levels of development or self-sufficiency or autonomy, because again, so frequently it just ends at, kids wanting to feel good with the rewards, let's say, and wanting to avoid the feeling bad.
Yeah, that's so true. And you brought up something I feel that is just so powerful, is that when we are operating from a developmental and a needs perspective or approach, it puts parents in the role of being a support system and a resource, which is so beautiful, because that's what really will create trust and connection and grow the relationship in a healthy way with a very solid foundation for years to come. And that's the type of relationship I think we all hope for with children, especially as they head into, the teen years and the young adult years, where we really would like for them to come to us and look at us as a resource as they become so much more independent. I mean, we think they're becoming really independent as toddlers. Well, independence takes on a whole new role once they, are young adults.
Yeah, and I think if we're like continuing, I know we're talking a lot about being a toddler, but if we can just kind of like peek into the future a little bit as to say, how come these foundational approaches now ultimately also not just help us during toddlerhood, but when they're young children, early adolescence, and even ultimately having positive relationships when your kids, when they're adult children. And the reason is because, what we know when we kind of look back, and there's different studies that have followed people for long periods of time. And looking backwards, one of the highest predictors of people who we would deem successful or living meaningful lives, or lives that they themselves are pretty satisfied with, looking back, the quality of their relationships with their parents at these early stages. One particular study, the Harvard Grant study, followed this group of men and throughout their whole adulthood, and the highest predictor of these people who in their adulthood would have all sorts of different ways of being what people consider successful. They measure in lots of different ways, like were they happily married, were they physically healthy, how much money did they make at their retirement, all sorts of broad measures, how satisfied were they in life. When you look backwards, those people that were most quote unquote successful by multiple measures, the highest predictor was how they described the warmth of their relationships with their parents when they look back. And I think that word warmth captures a lot of things. It captures, the suggestion that the relationship with the parents was, very connected and secure and felt good. But I also think that it also describes, maybe the quality of connection, right? Because the sense of warmth is something that I think describes something that ultimately feels like a sense of belonging or comfort. So I think that, when we look ahead, when children, the dynamic between children and parents when they're young is normal. It's normal that the parents are the caregivers and the kids are needing caregiving, but they do develop and they do grow along that process. You mentioned becoming a teenager. Once puberty hits and this developmental path continues, the purpose of adolescence is very different than childhood. The purpose of adolescence is to prepare these kids for adulthood. And that's the part where, kids in their teen years don't necessarily want their parents to like hover over them and take care of them. But a healthy relationship in adolescence is a dynamic where it's like the teenager uses the parents as a consultant. And then it's very similar to like in a business relationship. You still own the business as a teenager, but there are certain things that your company is not doing so well or you've never done before. So you want to hire this competent consultant. And you mentioned trust. So I think if you have this relationship-based, secure, fulfilling relationship throughout your childhood, there's a higher probability that in those teen years, even though their internal dynamic shifts where they don't want to be taken care of, they still might be more than willing to hire their parents as consultants to help them through their teenage years, which they need, And so just, again, if we're talking developmental past even these phases, we're still talking about laying a good foundation of a parenting style where if parents are successful in helping kids meet their needs, if parents are successful and encouraging for kids to grow in their own autonomy and their competency. And once they're able to do that, parents are supportive, but also get out of the way. And then also parents don't place expectations on their young kids to do things that are beyond their developmental capacity. Then I think kids comfortably sort of go through childhood with this sense of warmth, which again is a shorthand for a lot of the big relational needs that kids have when they're young.
Yes, I think that's so important. And I love that you just brought up, well, you really just described what it looks like for parents to be a resource for a child. And you brought up an important point that when it's important not to put expectations on children that they're not developmentally capable of. And we know, in the toddler years, they're very impulsive. There's a lot going on developmentally. And so it's really important to, have an understanding of, where they are at developmentally and the needs that are happening beneath the behavior to really build those foundational blocks. And I'm curious if you have any other advice to parents that really want to build this foundation using this developmental and needs perspective.
I think a good, practical and visual way to kind of think about the different ways in which parents can be supportive of children. It comes from a pretty old model from a child developmental psychologist, Lev Vygotsky. So he described this picture. So if you imagine when kids are born into the world, basically their capacity to do anything on their own is pretty low. So imagine you have this circle, and that circle is what kids who eventually become adults at some point in the future will be able to do, but at this moment in time, it's completely beyond them, right? So areas of future growth. Then at the center of this circle is a growing amount of competency. It's they can, from an early age, let's say if they're nursing or breastfeeding, like one of the things they can do is latch on appropriately, right? That's something that kids, have a certain instinct and intuition about as infants. But let's say it's okay, so they're able to do that. But let's say we're just talking about feeding themselves as a skill set. Then at some point, as motor development happens, kids can like pick up finger foods. And at some point, they know how to like clumsily use a utensil. And at some point, they can use the utensil very well. And so in the middle of the circle is their autonomy, which means the stuff that they can do by themselves with competency. And then in the space in between, just outside of what they're capable of doing with competency, is what Lev Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. It means that based on just how they're growing, the natural way in which human beings develop, it's like the bleeding edge of what they're about to be capable of. All right, so there's really three sections: future growth, in the middle autonomy, and then zone of proximal development. So as parents, we wear different hats depending on what we're recognizing our kids are able to do and not able to do. So if they're at a certain age where they're just not capable of doing certain things, right? You can't expect your 5-year-old to drive themselves to school, right? That's completely outside the scope of their ability. So as a parent, that is like 100% of our responsibility. And it is also in no way are we supposed to make our kids feel like something's wrong with them because they can't do that thing, right? Right. So that hat that we wear as parents, when we recognize that our kids can't do something yet, our role there is caregiver. We're absolutely fully responsible for taking care of them in ways in which they're not able to. Then in the middle zone, the autonomy, this is the part that should be of relief to parents. These are the things that your kids are able to do all by themselves, and you should actually step away and let them. Because when you do, it builds their ongoing self-confidence that they are recognizing that they themselves are growing in their abilities. And I think the more self-confidence they have in their autonomy, they're more likely to take risks in stretching themselves and trying new things. And as a parent, if you keep jumping in there when they're able to do something well, then it kind of confuses them. It makes them feel like, am I doing this wrong? Why do people keep doing this for me? And then they question themselves and they don't have as much confidence in trying other things. So in that role as a parent, it's the opposite of caregiving. It's actually like where we have this like healthy neglect. We step back and we let them do it. And then maybe the third component is the most active, where we would probably call it parenting, right? This is when we wear the hat of parents, where they're just emerging in their abilities to do something new. And that's where, as parents, we want to like pay attention and support them in ways that they can be successful. And like an example would be when your kids start taking their first steps and you recognize they've been cruising around on the furniture and you think it's right, they're ready. The first time you think they're going to take a bunch of steps, you don't like stand across the room 20 feet away and ask them to walk all the way across the room, right? The first thing you do is you kind of, give them just enough space to take 2 or 3 steps. And when they're able to do that well, then the next time, when they're willing to try, maybe you step back 5 feet and then further and further. And then next thing you know, they're able to like walk pretty successfully. And then what used to be in the zone of development is no longer in the zone. It's actually part of this growing circle in the middle of their autonomy. So parents, it's really 3 hats, depending on what you're looking at, depending on, again, the behavior. But again, the behavior is a sign that's pointing to their development and their needs. And if they're not capable, you're 100% their caregiver. No expectations to be placed whatsoever on them to do any of these things. If they've developed competency in being able to do things, we kind of step back and we let them do it and let them feel good about what they're capable of doing. And in this in-between zone, that's when we're really active, we're paying attention, and we're scaffolding and providing support for them to be successful in these sort of small developmental milestones in which they're just growing into.
Yes, I love that. And that's really where this development and needs perspective can really empower our parenting and empower our children, which is just really the root of it all, like what we're really overarchingly, like that's what we're going for, that's what we want to do. Sometimes it gets lost in execution, but overall that's what we're aiming for. And unfortunately our time is coming to a close, but I'm curious, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or if you have any last pieces of advice or encouragement for our audience?
I think something that I always like to remind parents, or sometimes parents have never heard this, which is that despite us talking about optimal and what's best, to actually pull that off in parenting, it just has to be good enough. It actually doesn't require this level of perfection. You just have to kind of, for the most part, most of the time, have these intentions and practices to kind of help your kids. So good enough parenting is actually more than enough in terms of parenting in general. So that's hopefully an encouragement, because I think oftentimes parents start to feel this pressure, especially if they're shifting their parenting styles, and they feel confused in that transition. They feel like there's this pressure that I have to do it really well, but at the same time I'm learning myself, and it's very scary. So good enough is actually more than enough. I think that's one. And then I think that, ultimately the thing to not lose is we're still talking about, at this age, a very relational approach. So part of the more than enough strategy for parents has to do with connectedness, and so it's not really built around strategies and what you're doing for your kids, but really at the foundation, it should come out of a relationship, connectedness, a bonding. And we're still at that phase, especially if we're talking about toddlers. We're still at the phase where the fundamental needs that they have are still to feel safe and secure and understood, and to feel good in your presence. Like, those are still the fundamentals at this stage, and what they need the most from parents.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's such a great reminder, and that's so powerful. And I always love to tell parents that parenting is at its essence a relationship, and the backbone of every relationship is communication, trust, and connection. And so that just really resonated with me.
Good.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing all of your knowledge and your wisdom with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you.